Hello, my name is Anat Admati, and I'm the Faculty Director of Corporation Society Initiative, CASI, and we are here recording another episode of our series, Power to Truth. And we have a great guest for this topic because it comes from an area in which they supposedly give us truth about some public companies, the area called accounting. So Karthik Ramanna is here with me. Hello, Karthik. Great to have you.
Thank you for having me, Anat.
We had, Karthik has a new book as he's visiting here. It's called The Age of Outrage. And we had a separate event about that. And so I'll talk to him about other things because we share interests in other things that are more appropriate for Power to Truth. In particular, I want to start by, so Karthik, well, just for introduction bio, and when we met, was a professor of accounting at Harvard Business School. So we share the sort of business school professors interested more broadly kind of little club. And in that role as an accounting professor, he wrote a book I became aware of about a decade ago, 2014. We now share the editor too, Joe.
Yeah, sure.
Called the Political Standards. And this was about the politics of something very esoteric called the Financial Reporting Accounting Standards, FASB, and how it works, and who designs these rules that we teach in our accounting courses, and what's the politics of that.
Yeah.
And also coined a very useful term that we later used in a conference that we collaborated on in 2020, December, just about 4 years ago, called Corporations and Democracy, in which we titled one of the sessions, Thin Political Markets. And the idea was that, in markets, in situations in which different ideas, there's expertise needed, like accounting, technical things, you might have a case where it might be the situation that the people with expertise also have some conflicts of interest, and that would change the way they write those rules, accounting rules being just one example of that. So can you talk a little bit about thin political markets and politics of accounting and other rules?
Yeah. Well, first off, huge thanks to have me on this in this forum. It's such a pleasure always to engage with you, Anat, and I always learn so much from you because you're someone who is able to go deep into something, but also then to connect it to sort of the profound issues in society that matter and that sort of help us live good, flourishing lives. That was really the spirit in which I came to this phenomenon of thin political markets.
You called it underbelly of capitalism.
Yes.
Was accounting.
That's right. The soft underbelly of capitalism. That was the term I used.
Yeah.
And, early in my career, I became fascinated by the process through which accounting rules were created. It's a fairly esoteric sort of subject. In part, I came to it because I was teaching accounting, and these rules were things we taught in the classroom. Yeah. And there was a question of, where did they come from? I mean, they weren't sort of dropped from heaven. So what was the process there? And three things came out as I started studying, and I looked at it in many, many different contexts of, accounting rules for mergers and acquisitions, for derivatives, accounting rules. Yes, goodwill, things like related party transactions. And, in each one of these settings, there was always a small group of people who were really informed on the issues, right? Usually somewhere between 5 and 50 people that really had the wherewithal as well as the time and commitment to really get into the details. So it was a small community of people. The second sort of finding was that community of people, because they were so informed on the subject, had a sort of very concentrated commercial interest in what the outcome should be, right? And usually, of course, they all fell on one side of that. And so perhaps not surprisingly, the outcome of these political processes tend to sort of skew in one direction, to the direction of the experts, right? the expertise is co-located with the commercial interest. And accounting rules, like many other fairly esoteric areas in capitalism and indeed in society more broadly, are, they're, when I tell people I study accounting rules, they generally walk away from me in cocktail parties. They're boring. They're really boring. And, so
it's just all invisible.
Exactly.
It's all the impact is invisible. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. So the kind of, because sometimes you have, even with esoteric issues, you have media spotlight, you have politicians running sort of campaigns on them, et cetera. But rarely on something like an accounting rule will you have that kind of spotlight. And to the extent that the press report on it, it'll be at a fairly superficial level. And, the citizens won't know what to do about that. Yes, they might be outraged about it in the moment, but then what happens? So it was that sense in which.
So the politics sort of fails in the bigger picture.
In the bigger picture. And it's sort of, so you've got the concentrated commercial interest, you've got the diffuse general interest, and you have this sort of what we call low issue salience. Right? The idea that this is not going to sell newspapers. It's not going to elect politicians. So who's responsible for these?
And what's the accountability?
So when you see, like, wait a minute, when I was teaching the accounting rules for goodwill, I said, well, there's sort of a double counting here, that the companies get to claim the benefit if the acquisition works off well, but they don't have to claim the loss when the acquisition doesn't work out. I said, wait a minute, how does this make any sense? And that's how I got interested in this question of, well, where did this rule come from? And surprise, surprise, it was the investment bankers that were sort of sitting at that table because nobody else could be bothered to sort of show up at the time.
And they wanted the deals to happen.
Right? Yeah. And so it's, and you see this time and time again. And that's what sort of drove me to write the book, Political Standards. And then, of course, the concept of thin political markets.
Yeah. So that was great for me because, here I was discovering what's going on in the sausage making of banking rules. And it's a huge mess. And even recently, when it became sort of salient, nobody, including senators, even knew what we were talking about.
The details
the notions that they don't understand the words you say, they don't understand anything about what it's all really about, and how you can have crazy nonsense kind of floating and then go fix it. So it's hard to even have a conversation about these kinds of things. So I was very excited to find somebody who,
a kindred spirit,
who wrote on the politics of accounting standard setting, because by then I knew that rules didn't come from heaven. That rules were people made constructs, and that politics mattered at every level of it. And that, just as a finance professor and you as an accounting professor, that's kind of a revelation. And I think in both our cases, it kind of changed our trajectory.
Indeed, the whole trajectory of my career changed because I pivoted into thinking about questions of leadership. And I said, well, here, at the time I was a professor in a business school, as you pointed out, and here I am teaching in a school of leadership. At the time I was teaching at Harvard Business School. These students in my classroom are going to go on to become the captains of industry that will then shape the next generation of rules. And are we even alerting them to this issue? Are we teaching this in the classroom? Not from a perspective of being normative about it and saying this is the right thing, but at least raising the salience of this and saying, well, I want you to reflect on what would be the implications of not paying attention to this structural question.
To the big thing about capitalism and markets and how they work.
And how do they connect to, here you are driving efficiency at the level of your corporation, but that really only has a legitimate social purpose if it connects in some way to that broad systemic structure. But if that systemic structure is broken by the very forces that are, driving, if the pursuit of profit involves undermining the rules of the game, then it becomes a one-shot game. And then, the system.
So all the things that are taken as if, somehow society gave us a set of rules and now you might make as much money as possible while obeying the rules is all completely gone logically if making as much money as possible means changing the rules.
And interestingly, this is not a political issue, right? Because you look at it, even Milton Friedman was aware of this problem. and had alluded to it from time to time. Now, he hadn't taken it perhaps as seriously as, because perhaps he lived at a time when our institutions were more robust than they are today.
Well, but you have next to him his good friend George Stigler,
yes,
who basically was saying, well, the industry controls all rules,
yes,
and therefore it's like it's lost.
Yes.
But he recognized when I had to write an essay about him, they were kind of, the 50-year mark came one after the other. 1970 and 1971 is when they wrote their seminal pieces. And on Stigler, when I read his piece on capture and how, government acts for the monopolists to give them more power and all that, he had a very nuanced view of politics. And he was saying you can use politics to do good or to corrupt the system.
Indeed.
And so it's like he was saying politics is endemic. And so then I raised the question in writing about it. So how are we going to make the politics work for good versus for the corruption? It kind of is an open-ended question.
And what do we do in particular in business schools to reinforce that point?
Exactly.
Because, this is something that business invariably controls, as Stigler points out. So I think, part of what I was trying to communicate in that work is that, look, this is not some sort of left-wing anti-capitalist, capitalism is broken. In fact, we want to champion capitalism, but it requires this nuance on the edge that even the arch advocates of a market society like Friedman had recognized.
The only problem with the way they said it and the way, we had an event here on the big myth is that they coined the term free market. And that became sort of this subtle connection between free, freedom to do stuff in the market, unconstrained, and freedom of speech or something. So it was basically capitalism versus totalitarianism, and they created this false comparison so that you were a communist, totalitarianism, state-controlled wages, and that was the way Friedman wrote his essay. So he wrote his essay in both of them, with a great hostility to government.
Yes.
And now you're teaching a policy school. So, obviously, by being so interested in these issues, I get to be a little bit of a misfit in a business school, and you would have been the same. But in a Blavatnik School of Government, you
funny.
thrive.
It's funny. Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I mean, I absolutely love the Blavatnik School and my role there and so forth. But in some sense, my colleague Dutch Leonard over at Harvard Business School, who actually has a joint appointment, he calls it bridge walking. Because there's
So,
and it's funny because the kind of work we do makes us, in some sense, outsiders and novices in both environments. Because in a school of government, the question is capitalism really that good? Why are you trying to save it? Right? And in a school of business, you say, wait a minute, what is all this stuff about, trying to constrain capitalism?
So, I feel similarly as I travel between here and the Center for Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, where I have this program just started this program on capitalism and democracy, where I see the sort of blind spots in the business school, what we don't cover enough. And what, I try to cover in my courses and in CASI, and what they're missing there about the way to make capitalism work or the way it can undermine democracy, and they're kind of skipping over that private sector part, which in our democracies now is controlling much of the economy, and its interaction with the government is where the action is, both in setting the rules and also contractually and otherwise. In other words, the way governments buy and interact commercially with all kinds of markets, and the way they write the rules.
And I just want to stress again this point, because somehow we've lost how central this is to the functioning of society, of a democratic capitalist society. Because when the first set of Supreme Court rulings that in some sense legitimized corporate political contribution and created this notion of corporate personhood as almost an equivalent voting, or not voting, but in this case, contributing voice and in society, one of the strongest dissents came from William Rehnquist, who, of course, is a very conservative justice and went on to become the Chief Justice, but at the time was an Associate Justice in the Supreme Court, and said, well, this is absurd. that you would think that somehow there is this right for the corporation. That is something quite different, right?
And so there is a book. So we started the conference on corporations and democracy with this book, We the Corporation, in which Adam Winkler, the author, said, corporations are persons. I mean, that ruling was actually using associations of people and constructing the argument differently. Corporations are persons in the law. For real, they can own property, they can sign contracts. Obviously, people do it on their behalf. But in terms of rights, which are many, what rights should they have? There are persons that are under 18 and we don't let them vote. There are persons under 16, we don't let them drive. So there could be persons, human persons that don't all have the same right. So you have to think about the corporation as a legal person and what rights it should have, what are appropriate for why we created it in the first place.
Exactly.
We gave it the right for limited liability, the right to own assets, the right for due process, all these rights.
And infinite life we've given.
And infinite life, exactly. And
which is a huge privilege.
It's huge privilege that humans don't have. And so they became that organization form became very strong, very sturdy. In some respect, sturdier than political institutions because politicians, when people say to me something about corporate short-sightedness, I say politicians are short-sighted even more. So the sturdiness of the corporation, I mean, sometimes when you have misconduct, then you just switch the CEO and the new CEO comes in, it's a new life.
And those corporate forms can be very good and useful. So we don't want to detract from them. And that's why I say, I mean, in some sense, that's
brought a lot of
wealth and innovation. And you look at how much, I mean, I sort of was born and I spent the first part of my life in India, which had sort of in some sense stagnated under socialism. And I saw firsthand how the unleashing of markets in that and has, basically in the first instance, lifted hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty, but in the second instance, created so much human flourishing.
So
created this aspirational society.
But you need a trustworthy government to kind of create good rules for everybody, including for corporations, to enforce the contracts, to enable the markets to work.
And this is good common sense.
Exactly. So once you sort of start going off of that basic theme, then you start having weird conversation with people, which make false choices and all of that. Because what does it mean? Free market, free to do what? What should you be free to do? Because people are free. We have freedom of speech. So again, how much of should the corporation speak? So right now we have, for example, the CEO of Telegram was arrested.
That's right.
In France. Now, what's that about? Free speech. We all treasure free speech. And the limits of free speech in the sense that while he claims free speech, he is not helping them enforce laws about, child trafficking, sex trafficking, things like that. And they're saying, okay, free speech to this point. If we ask you to collaborate with an investigation on a case in which real people were harmed, you have to give us the data.
And the point is that not so much to advocate. I mean, of course, we'll all have different views on what the limits of corporate rights are. But the point, more importantly, is to advocate the importance of that democratic conversation on an active, ongoing basis.
We choose to protect the children than to protect your free speech on the information of the criminals that you should give to the police.
Or at least to ensure that we bring front and center, particularly in business schools, because this tends to get lost in business schools, that we bring front and center the idea that there needs to be this constant, vibrant conversation in society, and particularly across corporate elites of how it interacts with society, right? And I think that's the bit that now, think about the moment we're living in terms of the transformative potential of AI, right? And AI promises or threatens to be as disruptive to society as the Industrial Revolution was. And in some sense, it's not an accident of history that the Industrial Revolution takes hold and has the kind of impact it has on creating prosperity and enabling a wider democracy because it happens in England, because it has that liberal tradition. And in the same way, we're very lucky that someone like Henry Ford was the person who invented the assembly line, because he also believed deeply in creating prosperity by allowing his own employees and people who are like them to buy his products, rather than by becoming concentrated monopolist that holds everything. And so now when we have the same question with AI, we face this profound moment where, well, the people who are going to make those decisions, exactly. It's a thin political market.
The benefits,
yes,
and who's going to pay the costs.
Right. And it's that thin political market. So the people who will implicitly make those decisions will be the elite here, in that the people you're educating here at Stanford Business School and at other top business schools around the world. And how are we equipping them to have these conversations? It's not telling them what's the right thing to do
in mind,
but it's alerting them to the fact that the course of human history will, whether they like it or not, be implicitly shaped by the kinds of moral choices they make. That's what we need to alert them.
So they think more small than they should.
Yes.
If they thought more big, we totally obviously are on the same exact wavelength, where it's like big picture is really important. And are we doing that, or are we making narrow people who are not thinking about it? So the truth is, in terms of power, the truth is the powerful notion of how it all fits in.
That's right.
And how that bigger picture matters. And how what you do would matter to that. So anyway, so tell us a little bit before we end about your big project right now, which has to do with
carbon accounting.
Carbon accounting, exactly. There's a lot of different initiatives on that. So you have a special one.
Yes, and in some sense, so it's funny because I did this work on financial accounting, and then I went into this leadership role because, in part, I was spending a lot of time thinking about the importance of leadership in society, and I wrote this book, The Age of Outrage. And now, as that book has come out, and I find myself going back to my accounting roots, in part because I stumbled on a very similar problem in carbon accounting as I had stumbled in financial accounting, which is, I mentioned earlier about how I saw the goodwill accounting standards and said, well, this doesn't make any sense. Why do we have this rule? And similarly, 3 years ago, I was a discussant at a conference in carbon accounting, which I just accepted, in part because it was COVID lockdown and I had, we had no social life. So I said, okay, I'll read the paper and go. And I said, wait a minute, this makes no sense. The way we do carbon accounting, this sort of what's called scope 3, completely defies any kind of basic logic. So how did we end up with this? And I started looking into that, and I realized that, there was an absence of, solid accounting expertise at the table. There were a lot of, in some sense, corporate interests that were therefore trying to shape the rules of the game. And there was a lot of, ideology that had infected the process and set it in a course that, in some sense, was detracting us from the objective, which is to align the competitive spirit of business to address this great global challenge. That's what a good accounting does. It aligns the interest of corporations with social purposes, with right? Now, part of what we're doing in the carbon accounting work is to bring back truth to it. The problem with the way we think about carbon accounting today, particularly scope 3, is it completely defies even the basic premises of what would be an accounting system. Verifiability, mutual, basically one company's accounts should be uniquely and not sort of double counted elsewhere. So it should be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. These are sort of things you would teach on the first day of accounting. And all of these seem to have sort of, in part, I think, because there is an ideological project in the way we think about carbon management today, which perhaps has actually perversely set us back from the decarbonization objective. And that because that ideological project essentially starts with the idea that somehow capitalism is the root cause of all evil and the root cause of all, climate destruction.
where do we
Yes, yeah.
interject
Exactly.
something into the system to
Exactly.
get what we want
Yes,
out
yeah,
of it?
exactly. And I think in some sense, it comes full circle because in each of these projects, I said that we're trying to be radically centrist. We're trying to be radically moderate
Yeah.
because you're trying to, in some sense, bring us away from our basest tendencies and bring us back to what is common sense. And so the whole project on carbon accounting is to say, what is a verifiable, truthful way in which to physically count the molecules of CO2 and other greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere from various corporate activities. The good news is it's actually relatively straightforward to do that because over hundreds of years, we've built out technology in inventory accounting, in cost accounting that applies to the context of carbon. And the record-keeping element of this has become vastly cheaper just in the last 5 to 10 years because of the development of things like distributed ledgers and so forth, because in the absence of distributed ledgers, this would be quite costly to maintain. But with the presence of distributed, in fact, this is probably one of the few socially useful applications of distributed. I'm not aware of any other one.
I mean, I was asking all the fintech sort of crypto people, they could come up with what's X Infinity in Philippines or something like that.
Yeah, so this actually could help.
What is it good for?
Yeah. So we said, okay, we've got these technologies available. Now, how do we use it to drive a solution that aligns business with this great global? And the example I give of that is just in time as an inventory management system. So, prior to JIT, there were two dimensions that sat on the way most companies thought about purchasing: cost and quality. And timeliness was not a dimension because in some sense, you didn't have the luxury of featuring that because you would have to keep, months, if not years of inventory, depending on. But as information systems got better and, and transportation technology improved, timeliness became a basis of competitive differentiation. A Toyota can keep 4 hours of inventory, and that frees up capital to do all the other things it wants to do.
Rage when I started my career and we were teaching just-in-time production.
So now you think about how, okay, you've created all these win-wins through the introduction of this new dimension. Now, another dimension here is emissions. And instead of thinking about emissions emissions management as something that companies take on as a burden. Imagine if oil companies competed on producing, barrels of oil that were the least emissions intensive. Cement companies competed on producing bags of cement that were the least emissions intensive. Steel companies did that for steel, and cattle farms did it for cattle, right? And it's all a question. And in some sense, once you create the performance measurement system, it unleashes value in ways that you wouldn't even know ex ante, right? It's like information supply creates its own demand, right? And that's the spirit.
Once the numbers are there and they are the right kind of numbers that you should be chasing.
The truth, yes.
Exactly, the truth.
Right. Yeah.
Then it becomes, it has its power to kind of impact what people, compete for.
And I say, actually, carbon accounting is easier than financial accounting because you are constrained by the laws of thermodynamics.
Exactly.
Right?
Valuations are always tricky. Are you marking to market? We in finance, we're always mocking accountants saying, well, you have your old values, you put, book values, they're useless. And then when you start doing market values, you're in finance.
Yes.
So what are you adding
exactly. Whereas here, the laws of thermo basically allow you, you've got the first law of thermo, energy cannot be created or destroyed. Boom. You've got, in some sense, an inherent check in the system that allows, so the combination of basic chemistry with, hundreds of years of accounting can create a really powerful system that aligns companies and the work of sort of competitive markets to solve this great global challenge. But to do it in a way that, quite frankly, no government will be able to do through top-down market design. Because the information that's needed to decarbonize the planet will come from billions of decisions, the bottom up.
Yeah, but we do need
the system,
somebody to make sure that this reporting happens.
The rules of the game. Exactly. Yes, that's right.
So once you unleash that,
Yes.
But, you often do need some coordination
Yeah.
mechanism on that.
So that project is called the e-liability project. Stands for environmental. And if your viewers want to learn more about it, you go to e-liability.institute. All the papers we write are free in the public domain. All the algorithms are free in the public domain. We have no commercial intent in this. We just want to do what we think is good for the world.
That's the idea. No commercial interest. That's how, the founders of Google thought about search, and look what happened to them.
Yes, no, I have no doubt that companies will make a lot of money on this, and that's a good and useful thing. Let them do that. But the algorithms are free.
Right, yeah.
Yes, and that's the key.
Yeah, but they were saying search should be in the academic domain.
Yes,
way back.
And we see this now with OpenAI,
Yeah.
right? Because that was supposed to be a not-for-profit too, and then the commercial intent took over.
Well, that was a great conversation. Lots of power to truth concepts came out.
Thank you.
And so thank you. It's great to have you.
Such a pleasure, and always.
We might elaborate on the
liability
in future, because you might come back to Stanford to talk about it. So I'll grab you for another conversation, because we did accounting and other stuff.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Thank you.
Yeah.